Welcome to Whiskosity Whiskey Reviews. My name is Brian. I'm your host. And today's episode, we're going to be here concluding this particular series of Suntory and Japanese whiskey. For those of you who didn't watch the others, watch that now. I had started with the Hibiki 17-year-old. Hibiki is a blend of whiskeys from Yamazaki, Hakushu, and Chita distilleries, which are Suntory's three main distilleries. So in my second review, I had talked about the Yamazaki 12-year-old, and the Yamazaki is the more famous of the distilleries. It's also Suntory's flagship brand. So now we're going to break it down even further, and we're going to talk about this, the Yamazaki Bourbon Barrel, which is a special release, and this one is from 2011. As I mentioned in my last review, a single malt is actually a blend of whiskeys. It's only single malt because it comes from a single distillery. However, in order to get a consistent product, they need to blend several types of whiskey to get something that tastes like the product that everyone knows and loves. In Yamazaki's case, they use various cask types, including their more common bourbon barrels, such as the one that this particular release came from. So, in summary, this is a component of this, which is a component of this. So, we also need to reiterate that Yamazaki has made huge strides in allowing versatility in their whiskey. They can't share whiskey like the other countries very easily, even though they actually own Bowmore, Auchentoshan, and Glengarry Scotch distilleries, to name a few. But they do most of the whiskey for their brands in-house, even though they stopped doing their own maltings around 1971. However, they do have 12 column stills of various shapes and sizes, and this affects the flavor. Also, Yamazaki has a water source that's rich in minerals, and this also plays a huge factor in the flavor, or at least a factor in the flavor. And it's somewhat because of the high mineral content, and yet it's very pure water. It's often compared to Glenmorangie in Scotland, and in fact, the water, because of the quality of the water, the 16th century tea ceremony master Sen no Rikyu had his tea house based around the same water source, and tea ceremonies in Japan still have their origin of pride around the Yamazaki area for the same reason as that quality of water. Yamazaki, for those who don't know, is smack dab in the middle of between Kyoto and Osaka, which are two major and awesome cities in Japan. That basically means you should stop there if you're vacationing those areas. It is Brian recommended. Okay. So, aside from still design and water, and Hakushu has even more versatility, by the way, but that's for future reviews way down the road, perhaps. Anyway, aside from all that, we get into the heart of this review, which is the wood. Okay, no snickering. Wood makes all the difference here, and everywhere. Again, no snickering. Seriously, though. In the world of whiskey, there's probably nothing that affects whiskey more than the wood that it's matured in. Like Scotch, since Japanese whiskey is made in pretty much every fashion as Scotch, whiskey is usually aged in used or repurposed casks. The more common is the bourbon barrels. Cheaper for one thing, more prevalent, and bourbon's far more popular than things like sherry and stuff like that. It also imparts the least amount of unique flavor in its own right, and that lets the true flavor of the whiskey come out. But it does still give some hints of vanilla and caramel and stuff, so it does provide some of its own flavor. But now, bourbon, it heavily chars their barrels usually. Well, Japan simply toasts it, so it doesn't provide as much flavor. You know, in typical American fashion, we like to go extreme, you know, like orange fake crazy tans and burn yourself to a crisp. Go big or go home. Yamazaki, though, aside from bourbon barrels, all in all, they use 5 main types of casks. They use a barrel, which is a size. A lot of people think that it's, you know, like what it's aged in, but barrel is the size, but it's American oak. There's also a hogshead, which is a little bit larger of a barrel, which is actually made up of pieces of the regular barrels. European oak, they also use puncheon casks, as well as Mizunara, or Japanese oak, as I've mentioned in the past. They also use Spanish Oloroso sherry casks, and those are their main casks there. Each one gives distinct flavors. Usually these are all blended to make the 12-year-old and 18-year-old Yamazaki, as well as all the different types of hibiki, like the 17-year-old we have here, 12-year, 21-year-old, 30-year-old, and so forth. Recently, though, Yamazaki started doing annual releases of their individual types of wood-matured whiskeys. Both Yamazaki and Hakushu gave 25-year-old sherry cask releases that just eat up all the awards around. Yamazaki often does a special Mizunara release, and that's just Yamazaki, and it sells out instantly. There's very small quantities, and it is an absolute fortune, but it also wins crazy awards left and right. Hakushu has its unique offering in a heavily peated variation, but again, we're going to leave Hakushu for another day, hopefully. Both distilleries, though, have both bourbon and puncheon releases. Actually, I'm sorry, I could be wrong on the Hakushu puncheon, but for sure they both have bourbon barrel releases. And that's their low end, though it's not really low. I'll get into that later. So the other important thing is that when I say bourbon, don't expect it to taste like bourbon, like at all. This is still a standard single malt style whiskey, like Scotch. But it's a very good one. It's still tamer and more tolerable to bourbon fanatics, though, but it doesn't get that corn sweetness or the strong wood flavors that you typically find in bourbon. And this is important to discuss because people who don't know the nuances of whiskey like that may get confused. They may just like say, I hate Scotch, but hey, this is bourbon barrel. That might be good. It's going to taste like bourbon. But that's not the case. But this should still be okay. You see, for the most part, a Scotch drinker can become a bourbon drinker, but almost never vice versa. That doesn't mean anything much, so don't read into that and send hate comments. That was just a random observation. Not only have I seen it in other people, but I particularly, too, being American, grew up mostly on bourbon. I love my bourbon, and so I understand that. But I happily made the transition. First time I had Scotch, I thought it was disgusting, but I've grown to love it just immensely. And that doesn't always happen with bourbon drinkers. It happens more often with Scotch drinkers getting into bourbons. Bourbon barrel does not mean bourbon whiskey, okay? You get it, I know. I've said it like 6 times. Shut up. All right, I get it. So enough rambling. Let's keep this one short and sweet. I've already talked enough about these whiskeys and the company, and I'll probably talk about it again in future reviews when I come back to Sun Tree offerings. So let's get into the tasting. So the Yamazaki Bourbon Barrel, okay, on the nose, we get honey, vanilla, some very mild coconut, and a bit of pineapple. You know, it's nice and simple and pleasant. The palate. Get some strong oak and vanilla. There's no surprise there. It's that bourbon oak, like I said. Again, there's some citrusy pineapple in there, and a hint of orange rind too. I get some of that bourbon-like caramel in there too, dancing around. And there's some more bitter wood as well. The finish is a medium finish again. And again, there's some bitter oak. There's some sweet orange and more vanilla. And again, some more touches of coconut in there. Now, even though this is around $100, and that was the point I was going to make before about it not really being the cheap one, it is a special release, okay? and I still give this an 8.4 out of 10. I'm not knocking any points for value because it's just wonderfully designed. They took their time and effort into this, and there's a reason it's a special release. And it's unique. I think a lot of people would appreciate this, especially people who like the Yamazaki 12-year-old, of course, since this is a big component of that. You know, it's fruity, and it's balanced, and it's mellow. It's a great daily dram, something nice to just sit back and drink on a somewhat regular basis, but maybe treat it for somewhat special occasions. Some nice friends, not the ones you hate, that you spit in or bring out stuff that you call whiskey that isn't whiskey. None of us do that, I swear. And even though it doesn't taste like bourbon, it has all the great bourbon flavors like vanilla and caramel. It has more citrus than the Hakshu variation of the bourbon barrel. I've had that too. They're both great. I like this one a little bit better. So I'd pick it over that too. So is it worth buying? Now there's a caveat as opposed to the Yamazaki 12-year-old because it's more expensive. But I still think it's worth buying. But again, the high price could detract a lot of people. However, this is a single malt, unlike the Hibiki, so those people who are really picky and jerks would appreciate this one a lot more. And it's exotic, and it's a rare version of a popular classic. You know, the Yamazaki 12-year-old, this is far more rare. It's Yamazaki and it's Suntory, and it's Japanese. Like I said, it's exotic, it's Japanese, especially in America. That's interesting. We're simpletons. Well, I am at least. Unfortunately, it might be a bit hard to get. It's impossible to get in America, as far as I know. So I know Americans are like, dang you, I sat around to the end of the video and you tell me I can't even get it. But it is appearing in European markets, and as usual, if you make a trip to Japan, snag it up, surprise people. But I definitely recommend it if you can get your hands on it. It's a unique offering, and you can't go wrong with Yamazaki's or any Suntory, in my opinion. That's about it. Wrapping up this introduction to Suntory and Japanese whiskey. Stay tuned, we'll probably bring it back again. But next time we're going to bring things back to America for our reviews, and we're going to review some actual bourbon and not just bourbon barreled aged Scotch-like whiskey. So for now, have a wonderful night. I'm going to enjoy this one. Happy drinking. I'll catch you next time.